And who knows who broke, everyone has a theory.
I know.
Who broke it up?
John.
John did.
Yeah.
And he tried to pin it all on you.
For decades, the world has incorrectly blamed one member of the Beatles for their imminent breakup in 1980.
It was depressing. And not knowing whether I was going to continue in music, that was kind of depressing.
However, at 82 years old, one of the only surviving members of the rock and roll band, Sir Paul McCartney, has finally revealed to the public the real reason the band stopped recording and performing together, and who was responsible for the breakup. Was it Yoko Ono, like some people believe? Was it Paul McCartney himself?
Oh God, a bit intrusive. She used to sit in on the recording sessions, and we'd never had anything like that.
You won't believe what the reason for the Beatles' breakup was. Join us as we shed light on how Paul McCartney finally reveals who really broke up the Beatles. Early life of Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney's work as a member of the Beatles throughout the 1960s and 70s, and his solo career after the band broke up in 1980, has helped cement his name in the pantheons of popular music as one of the artists who helped transform rock and roll into a creative, highly commercial art form. According to Guinness World Records, Paul McCartney is the most commercially successful songwriter of all time, and BBC News named him the greatest composer of the millennium, with his Beatles song Yesterday named the most covered song of all time after being covered by over 2,200 different artists. But before McCartney was penning hits for the Beatles, alongside the late John Lennon, before he appeared on 20 #1 songs with the band, before Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Abbey Road, Paul was a scholarship student at the Liverpool Institute for Boys after passing the 11+ exam at the young age of 11, studying music and art. Born James Paul McCartney on June 18, 1942 in Liverpool, England. He was raised by a maternity nurse mother and a cotton salesman father who doubled as a jazz pianist with a local band. Paul got his earliest musical inspirations from his father and was encouraged to develop his musical skills by his old man. But ironically, the senior McCartney wasn't sold on McCartney's ambitious dreams of being a rock star. He even told his son that he was never gonna make any money with the Beatles. The McCartneys lived in a traditional working-class neighborhood in Liverpool's Walton area, much the same as the families of other Beatles members Ringo Starr and George Harrison. Tragically, when Paul was only 14 years old, his mother, Mary McCartney, died of complications after having surgery for breast cancer. The year was 1956. It would go on to be a pivotal year in the life of young McCartney, as he received a nickel-plated trumpet from his jazz musician father, Jim McCartney. But what his father did not know was that Paul's musical interests had greatly shifted towards the blooming rock and roll genre across the ocean in America. This newfound passion led Paul to trade his guitar for an acoustic guitar. Paul initially struggled with playing right-handed as he was a southpaw, but after seeing a poster of left-handed guitarist Slim Whitman, Paul restrung his guitar to suit his left-handed style. Although his father had suggested that Paul take music lessons, he preferred to learn by ear, listening to American rock and roll singer Little Richard and learning to play like him. His idolization of Little Richard led him to perform the American singer's hit song Long Tall Sally during a talent show for Butlins Filey's summer camp in 1957. That same year, McCartney wrote his first original song, a number he titled When I'm 64, which he hoped to one day sell to Frank Sinatra. But his musical journey would take him somewhere he never expected, forming the Beatles and stardom. On July 6, 1957, 16-year-old Paul McCartney met a band named the Quarrymen at the St. Peter's Cathedral Festival in Walton. The Quarrymen infused their brand of rock and roll with a local genre known as skiffles, which was a fusion of jazz, blues, and folk elements. The band's lead singer was a smart-mouthed 16-year-old named John Lennon, who immediately took a liking to Paul, and after seeing the latter's musical skills, invited him to join the band as rhythm guitarist. Just like Paul, John Lennon had also lost his mother at a young age. The two bonded over this common experience and eventually formed a songwriting partnership and friendship. Over the next 4 years, the band went through a series of musical and structural changes. Adding new members to the repertoire, they invited George Harrison to play with them as lead guitarist in 1958, and a friend of John's from art school by the name of Stuart Sutcliffe to play as bass player in 1960. In August of that year, the core lineup was complete when Pete Best joined the group, which had gone through so many monikers before finally settling for the Beatles. The new Beatles band became a regular act at Liverpool's Cavern Club, playing to crowds as big as 500 people on some nights in a 200-people capacity venue. Soon every partygoer in Liverpool knew about the little local band making waves all over the city. This little fame they garnered in the city soon landed them a residency opportunity in Hamburg, Germany. This little move would change the band forever. The boys spent their time in Hamburg honing their skills, working on a signature sound influenced by infusing their English rock and roll sound with the local sounds of Hamburg. While in Hamburg, Stuart Sutcliffe's new girlfriend, Astrid Kircher, who was an artist and photographer, helped to rebrand the Beatles, styling them and inventing what would later become the most famous haircut of the 1960s. She took the boys to a hair salon, and that is when they got a semi-bowl cut, with a blunt cut rather than layered, with bangs down to the eyebrows level and sideburns to the earlobe. Due to how big the band would become, this hairstyle would later be known as the Beatle cut, and millions of boys around the world would imitate it. Now they had their image and sound, but there were no records yet. But in 1961, not long after Stuart Sutcliffe announced he was leaving the group, and Paul McCartney finally had the chance he had been hoping for to take up the role of bass player for the band. It was after this change that the band had the opportunity to record professionally for the first time, when they backed English artist Tony Sheridan on his song Me Bonnie, under the moniker The Beat Brothers. This recording caught the attention of Brian Epstein, a music columnist who managed his family's record store. This one simple move would completely change the lives of the boys and Epstein himself forever. Soon after, Richard Starkey, another young man from Liverpool who later went by the stage pseudonym Ringo Starr, joined the group as their drummer. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows for the band. You see, Pete Best had been performing with the Beatles for over 2 years, and he had his little cult fan base. But the band had no choice but to let Best go and replace him with Starr, who had previously built a little fame while working with the band Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. Best's fans were not happy. But little did they know that this new lineup of Beatles was about to change music history forever. The group's new manager, Brian Epstein, worked tirelessly to get the band a record deal and eventually got them a meeting with George Martin, an executive from EMI Records. In October 1962, shortly after getting signed, the Beatles achieved their very first hit with the single Love Me Do. This song planted the seeds of the pandemonium and clamor for Beatles music that would later be known as Beatlemania, all over Britain. It wouldn't take too long for Beatlemania to cross the Atlantic and spread to the United States. The group's first introduction to American audiences was a series of appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show, the biggest primetime variety show of the 1960s that also helped launch the career of the Jackson 5 in the early 70s. Their first appearance on the show, on February 9th, was seen by over 73 million viewers, and came to be regarded as an iconic cultural moment that launched Beatlemania in America, and was also the launching pad to their fame around the rest of the world. The media often referred to this moment as the beginning of the British invasion of American pop music, as other British acts would follow the Beatles' footsteps of crossing over to the US, including the Rolling Stones. Lennon-McCartney rivalry. Early on in their careers, Paul McCartney and John Lennon struck creative gold when they began writing songs together and agreed that all of their songs would be credited to Lennon-McCartney, no matter who had taken the lead, or, as happened occasionally, written the songs entirely on their own. However, Paul McCartney wrote more hits for the band than any other member, including songs like Yesterday, Hey Jude, Let It Be, and Hello Goodbye, which would provide the soundtrack for the whole 1960s decade known as the Swinging 60s. Lennon and McCartney soon became the most popular members of the group, taking up lead roles from songwriting to vocals, and two camps of Beatles fans soon appeared. One in support of Lennon being the most important member of the group, and the other stating that McCartney was the most important member of the group. Even though the two singers were on friendly terms with each other, creatively, one could sense some rivalry of their own brewing. The rivalry only intensified with the release of The Rubber Soul in 1965. On this album, Paul McCartney's role in the band increased beyond just songwriting to instrumentalist, arranger, producer, and de facto musical director.
That we got over it.
Yeah.
Because if we hadn't, and then John goes and gets killed.
Did McCartney really break up the Beatles? For 50 years, the myth that Sir Paul McCartney was the one who broke up the most iconic band in history has been in the media, but Paul has always maintained that he was not the one who broke up the Beatles. A new documentary titled Get Back chronicles the last months of Beatlemania during the rehearsals of the band's last album, Together in 1969. The documentary sheds some light on the events leading up to the breakup. It shows the Beatles struggling to rehearse for a TV show in 1969, tensions running high. The TV show never happened, and the band's divisions grew wider. Despite Paul's incessant denials, the myth persisted. The seed had been planted already, and he had to carry the blame for decades. But why did it persist for so long? And why is Paul still keen on setting the record straight, even after 50 years? It all started in 1970, when Paul announced his self-titled debut solo album, sending shockwaves around the world. After 10 years of performing and touring together, it seemed to fans that the Fab Four were no longer together. The news spread like wildfire. By the year 1969, the Beatles were already on the brink of breakup. John Lennon had started working with his new project, the Plastic Ono Band, with his new wife, while Paul McCartney was secretly recording his solo album under the pseudonym Billy Martin. Meanwhile, John had brought in producer Phil Spector to work on the Get Back tapes from the previous year. But when the resulting album, Let It Be, was finished, Paul was upset. He felt that Spector had added too much orchestration to his songs. The tensions came to an all-time high when the Beatles couldn't agree on whether Paul's solo album or the Let It Be album should be released first. After a huge argument, the others backed down, and Paul's album was released on April 17, 1970. But the damage was already done. At a press release, Paul was asked by a reporter if he and John would ever write songs together again now that they both had their solo projects going on for them. Paul answered no, and not long after the tabloids began reporting the end of the Beatles. The news broke in the Daily Mirror first, on April 10, 1970. Paul quits the Beatles. This was the origin of the Paul McCartney destroyed the Beatles narrative, which Paul still maintains is a myth. John, on the other hand, was angry that Paul had beaten him to the punch. He had wanted to announce the breakup 6 months earlier. However, he managed to get his revenge in an interview with Rolling Stone magazine at the end of the year, where he tore into the Beatles' myths and criticized his bandmates for their treatment of his wife, Yoko Ono. Paul tried to stay out of the public feud, but did write a letter to the melody maker saying that the Beatles would never get back together. And with that, the greatest band of all time was no more.
What I mean is, in the way he meant it, that my music is only at the level of kind of crummy music. I know that's not true.
The first Beatles to quit the band. What the world didn't know was that there was a lot more to that story behind the scenes, and everything they thought they knew about the breakup was incorrect or half-truth. For example, the band had broken up long before the public announcement, and Paul wanted even the first Beatle to call it quits, like they thought. In August 1968, Ringo Starr was feeling frustrated during the recording of the 9th Beatle album, The White Album. He didn't feel like he was playing his best, and he thought the other 3 Beatles were getting along great without him. He felt like an outsider, and the tension was obvious. Ringo got so fed up that he walked out of Abbey Road Studios for 2 weeks before the album was even finished. But eventually, he returned, and the sessions continued. The Beatles finished the White Album in October 1968. A few months later, in January 1969, the Beatles started the Get Back sessions. But this time, it was George Harrison's turn to feel frustrated. He had just visited folk legend Bob Dylan and the band in Woodstock, and he loved their collaborative approach to music. But back in London, he felt like his own songs were being ignored in favor of half-finished ideas from John and Paul. George felt like he was being overlooked, and it was taking a toll on him. The tensions were running high, and it was already looking like the band was starting to fall apart when John quit the Beatles. But even after the terrible experience of recording the White Album, John Lennon suggested that the group make a 10th studio album, although they all agreed to it. The reluctance of each member to accept the proposal let them know it was going to be their final album together. In the spring and summer of 1969, the 4 Beatles rented Abbey Road Studios in London to record what would become their final album. Abbey Road. After the album was finished, John, Paul, and George met on September 9th to discuss the future of the band. They recorded their conversation so Ringo, who was absent, could catch up later. During the meeting, John Lennon suggested they make another album with more songs from George and fewer pop songs from Paul. Paul said, "Even on our worst days, we're still a band. We're still playing music together." But just a few days later, John and his wife, Yoko Ono, flew to Canada for a music festival, where John performed with Eric Clapton and showed off his solo work. This decision did not sit well with the rest of the band, especially since he was the one advocating for the band to stay together. Despite this tension, on September 20th, the Beatles still met with their record label, EMI, to sign a new contract. During this meeting, John dropped a bombshell on his band members. "I want a divorce," he said. Paul said in an interview, "Our jaws dropped, and we signed the contract in a daze." After that meeting, the members of the band began blaming Yoko Ono for influencing John's decision and being a stumbling block in the relationship between the boys.
I have a hard time impressing them. I
Is
said,
that good
well,
for
I'm
you?
famous in the world. Yeah.
The Yoko Ono conspiracy theory. Another very popular misconception that exists in Beatle lore is that Yoko Ono broke up the band. This theory has been widely debated among fans and biographers, with some arguing that her influence over John Lennon contributed to the band's demise. However, this theory has been largely debunked by the Beatles themselves, with Paul McCartney and George Harrison both stating that the band was already experiencing creative and personal tensions before Yoko's involvement. John Lennon and Yoko Ono met in 1966 at the Indica Gallery in London. where Yoko was preparing an art exhibit. At the time, John was still married to his first wife, Cynthia Lennon. Yoko was married to Anthony Cox. Yoko introduced John to avant-garde art and music. In May 1968, John and Yoko spent a weekend together at Yoko's home, where they recorded experimental music and made art together. Soon after, John got separated from Cynthia in August 1968 and married Yoko in 1969. Despite denying that she prompted the group's breakup, McCartney, on an episode of his podcast, McCartney, A Life in Lyrics, Paul McCartney also stated that she was definitely a source of tension between Lennon and the other members. While she may not have instigated the breakup, McCartney, she claims that she at least helped build some of the tension that led to the breakup. He stated that during the recording of the White Album, John insisted that Yoko should be present in the studio. Although the others allowed it, they had their reservations. As McCartney recalled, "None of us really liked it." Yoko's presence disrupted the band's established workflow with producer George Martin, which added to the existing tensions within the group. "We had a way of working, just the four of us with George Martin, but Yoko's presence changed that. It was like an interference in the workplace," explained McCartney. He admitted that they didn't want to be confrontational, so they tolerated Yoko's presence. "We just bottled up our feelings and got on with it," he said. But it was hard for them to accept the reality because studio time was more than just a creative space for them. It was also their job. "This was our life's work. We took it very seriously," McCartney emphasized. In the episode after he cleared up the myth that Yoko Ono broke up the Beatles, Paul McCartney answered a question that has been asked for over 50 years to finally put an end to the myth that he had broken up the band. "I didn't instigate the split. John walked into a room one day and said, 'I am leaving the Beatles.' Is that instigating the split or not?" he said, referring to John's "I want a divorce" statement during the meeting with EMI to renew their contract.
Money we'd earned and all that fame was going down the pan.
Other reasons. The band split up. Even though John Lennon was the one to pull the plug on the Beatles, the band was already at a crossroads while recording their last two albums. Between 1968 and 1970, after 10 years together doing all they could have done as a group, it was time for the members to go ahead and pursue their personal endeavors. There are several other reasons not related to Yoko Ono or any of the band members that caused their breakup. Some of these reasons include financial struggles and the death of their manager, and the changing soundscape of popular music at the time. By 1970, the Beatles' sound was no longer as in demand as it was in the early 60s. John Lennon, for one, had been pointing this out since 1965, and famously said in an interview that he didn't want to be 40 years old singing "She Loves Me." He wanted to explore other sounds. Meanwhile, business disputes were also plaguing the band. They were facing financial struggles and management issues, made worse by the departure of their beloved manager, Brian Epstein, who tragically passed away from an accidental overdose of sleeping pills and alcohol in his London apartment at the young age of 32. To make matters worse, they were physically and mentally exhausted from a decade of non-stop touring, and the strain was starting to show. Epstein's death left a void that couldn't be filled. The Beatles, led by John, tried to manage themselves, but it was too much of a daunting task. They had always relied on Epstein to handle their business and image, and his absence exposed the cracks in their relationship. In the end, the Beatles' inability to find a suitable replacement for Epstein, combined with their own personal issues and creative differences, led to their eventual breakup. Epstein's death marked the beginning of the end for them. Who do you think is responsible for the Beatles breaking up? Do you think the Beatles should have stayed together, or it was better they went solo? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.